Well, we're now joined by Patty Hajdu, the Minister for Indigenous Services. Minister, thank you for joining us today.
Great to be here.
Now, when your government was first elected, the Prime Minister called on his ministers to focus the relationship with this country's Indigenous peoples, and that was a hopeful sign for many. But now, I think there is greater skepticism around the Prime Minister's commitment. What would you say to that?
Well, listen, I think that Indigenous people have been wanting an honest relationship with Canada for a very long time. And so I think that when people are impatient for action, it's an indication of just how long they've waited. And so I think that the kinds of structural changes that we're making through law and the changes in funding formulas that are focused on equity are certainly making a difference. But I think we still have a long road to go on reconciliation.
Yeah, a long road, as you say. And, you know, I think a challenge for your government right now is the progress on the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Only 13 of 94 are looked on as being completed. And the Yellowhead Institute, and I know you know this, they're on record as saying at this rate, the calls won't be met for another 40 years. Does your government have a sense of urgency around those calls still?
We certainly have a sense of urgency of working in a truthful, respectful way with Indigenous communities on issues that matter to them. And the things that the kinds of investments that we've been making, for example, 156% increase in the operations funding for First Nations communities, the attempt to end all boil water advisories with a huge amount of progress, you know, the work on building housing together with First Nations on First Nations. So, for example, for every one house built under the previous Conservative government, there's been 9 repaired or built houses by the Liberal government. And then I would say the underlying legislative change that is restoring self-determination to communities to operate in ways that in many cases well, in all cases, are actually culturally centered and appropriate.
Okay, and I appreciate what you just said, that there's still this sense of urgency, but you know, there has been this criticism that there's this perception that Indigenous issues have been put on the back burner. And when I say that, I'm thinking about essentially the Native Women's Association of Canada, because as you know, they gave your government a failing grade when it comes to making progress on the calls to action that came from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Do you understand that frustration? How would you describe the source of that frustration?
Well, I think that when I describe the source of the frustration, what I think is that systemic change that the colonial approach has, the systemic change that's required to move from a colonial top-down approach is challenging. And communities are anxious for change because it's their families we're talking about. Look, you know, when we talk about the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry, I was one of the 3 ministers tasked to go around and talk to families as we launched that inquiry in 2015. And what families told us were just horrific stories of loss and trauma and pain, and we heard from women themselves who had survived many experiences of violence. So impatience is completely understandable and in fact helpful, because we want to move more quickly. I see the pushing of Indigenous people as an important piece of fast action from not just our government, but the government of Canada writ large. And that's why the work that we're doing on the things like passing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is so important. You know, I've mentioned this in other interviews. I will hopefully table water legislation this fall that will be the first legislation of its kind in approaching, I think, full co-development with Indigenous people to meet the needs of ongoing clean water in First Nations. So we're changing the way that we create law in this country. That's difficult, but that is the foundational work that I think is going to bear the fruit of the kind of change people want.
Okay, so as we approach another National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, then I'm wondering what your message is to Canadians, both Indigenous and not, whose faith might be shaken not only in your government, but in Ottawa's ability to actually take on reconciliation more seriously and faster.
Well, first of all, I would say that reconciliation is a path that all Canadians need to be on. You know, governments are held to account by voters, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and so we need to make sure that all of our parliamentarians here understand the importance of reconciliation, not just because it's the right thing to do, not just because we have legal agreements called treaties in some cases or other formal legal agreements, but because it makes a stronger country when everybody has a fair chance to succeed. What we're talking about if we endorse systemic discrimination is we're talking about leaving people behind, and that is obviously terrible for the people themselves, but terrible for the potential of Canada. You've heard economists talk about the need to be focused on our economic growth and our economic power and the ability for a better productivity in our country, and part of that is making sure that people have all the tools of success. So what I would say is that this Liberal government is determined to continue on this path, even though conversations are always going to be challenging this space. But I think that as we create those tools of self-determination, increasingly communities are becoming, they are taking back the power that's rightfully theirs to determine how best to raise children, to have equity in education systems, something else our government changed, to make sure that kids growing up in First Nations communities see themselves as having a vital place in this community. And that's going to take not only all levels of government, but all Canadians to embrace this national project.
Minister Hajdu, always appreciate the time. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Michael.